Rain, driver market moves, technical regulations. There's been a lot to offer here at this weekend's Canadian Grand Prix, but we've brought in ESPN's Laurence Edmondson. We're going to be talking technical regulations for 2026. Now, the FIA offered a bit of a preview of those regulations with a heavy emphasis on preview because there are going to be a number of changes made there that the teams are going to be looking for, no?
That's right, they don't have to be signed off until the end of this month, and even that seems like a slightly ambitious target to get everything nailed down. And it's clear from the early conversations we've had with teams, with the FIA themselves, that these regulations aren't quite mature yet. And of course, it's still a little way until they come into effect, 2026. But in that period, there's a lot of work the team's going to do. But the FIA have taken an approach whereby they want to set the bar very low. They want to be very restrictive to start with because they know the teams are going to push back. And like any negotiation, they want to start from a position where they've got a lot of leeway to play with, where they can make sure their objectives, which essentially is this new power unit that's very ambitious in what they're trying to achieve with it, a lot of electrical power, to make sure that is a key part of these new regulations, and then to allow some possibility for more overtaking, better racing, all the stuff we want to see from Formula One, they want to make sure happens. They don't want to have their arm twisted by the team to the point that they're not able to negotiate those things. So that's why we've got this quite restrictive starting point that's had some feedback from drivers, teams that appears negative, but the FIA are planning that so that they can then work back to something that they're happy with, teams are happy with.
It was interesting though, yesterday we got to sit in on a press conference with Andrea Stella, and like just hearing him even talk about the power unit and the changes that they're actually talking about making with the power unit. Because remember when the regulation for the power unit came out and they were talking about 50-50 split between the battery and the internal combustion engine, and then Andrea's in there saying like, well, you know, maybe if we only used 50% of the battery when we're attacking somebody or something would make more sense. So I found that really interesting because it's what's brought a lot of the newer manufacturers into Formula One was the idea of this new generational hybrid unit, and now you had someone like Andrea kind of saying it could need a bit of a rethink.
Well, it is just hugely ambitious. What they're asking of that battery to do is massive. These engines right now produce 1,000 brake horsepower. That's the level they want to keep it up. But to have 50% of that, 500 brake horsepower, coming from a battery that gets recharged every lap is a huge engineering challenge, and that's why we've got these slightly strange or slightly alien to us chassis regulations and aerodynamic regulations, because all of those are working to give that power unit as much assistance as possible by reducing drag on the cars, reducing downforce on the cars. Because if you put one of the 2026 engines in one of these cars, it would get halfway down the straight, run out of battery power, be reliant on the petrol side of it, which has already been reduced from about...
Imagine that though, like you're full throttle down the straightaway and you gotta lift off.
Yeah, not that you lift off, you keep full throttle, but the drag on the car would slow it down to the point that you'd have to change down a gear to get more power from that combustion engine, which obviously is now running on fully sustainable fuels, is down on power already. So there's all these factors that are milling around, and really this whole regulation set is based around these engines. It's to make sure that we can have these engines, and a lot of people will probably be watching at home and saying, why do we need this? I just want to watch cars race. I want them to be noisy. I want them to be fast. Why do we need 50% battery power? As you said, it's so that F1 can remain relevant. There's more power unit manufacturers in 2026 than we've had for a long, long time.
Yeah, very long time.
Audi have joined the party. That's why. Now, whether you think that's the right direction for F1 or not is up for debate, but that's the way we're going.
Speaking of that direction, with all the parity that we've seen so far this season, as well as this weekend here thus far, and also knowing that these regulations obviously tend to create such large gaps at the very beginning, do you think, would you agree with what the drivers have said themselves, where they're not that excited to see those gaps, and it might be a bit early to see these regulations come into place?
Yeah, that is a big concern. It's always been the case with regulation changes. I mean, you look at 2022.
We were in Bahrain, you and I, and we had this conversation.
Absolutely.
Man, sorry to cut you off, Laurence, but it's the point where you have the regulation, you need to let it sit, you need to let the convergence happen, and then we get to see some great racing. I mean, it's starting to kind of happen this season. Next season, it appears that it could be, 3, maybe even 4 teams that at some races could be battling for victories. And then all of a sudden you're just going to do away with all of that, bring in another new set of regulations. You're going to have a huge gap between teams again. And then you're going to have another few seasons of teams trying to catch up. I just think you have to let him breathe.
And,
you have to let him breathe.
And this is history repeating, because remember, the best season that I think any of us have ever seen, 2021, was right at the end of a regulation cycle. Okay, there were some little tweaks to those regulations that year that helped Red Bull catch up, but it was right at the end of that cycle. Then we went into 2022. Ferrari looked good initially, but quickly trailed off, and we ended up with this Red Bull dominance, which is only just starting to be overcome. So I think, we have to go into these new regulations, especially because they're so engine-led. I remember last time we had big engine-led regulation changes, Mercedes got a big step forward. Talking to people up and down this paddock, they think Mercedes again are the team that are going to get a step forward going into that. So again, we could see a similar situation.
We've been a little bit pessimistic thus far in our discussion, but there are some positives, to these regulation changes. Are there anything in particular that you are excited to see how it's implemented on track there, Laurence?
Well, I'm hopeful that there will be better racing, because 2022, those regulations were brought in with the idea that the cars would be able to follow closer to each other. They could initially. It was a step forward on 2021 initially, but we've already got back at a point where it's becoming difficult again. And that's because the teams are just finding new ways of doing stuff that the FIA never imagined. But the FIA have learned those lessons, and they've put them into this set of regulations. So one of the things we've not really talked about is how they're managing the wake, the aero around the cars to make it easier for cars to follow. So hopefully there'll be another step that way. Also, less downforce on these cars. It means slower lap times, but it should also mean better racing. If you put more reliance on the mechanical grip of the tyres, then in theory you will get better racing. How long that will last, again, it's one of those things where the teams close up, but also the racing tends to get worse over time.
Yeah, just another note on the mechanical sort of grip from a race car. I mean, that's where you kind of tend to see your best racing, right? It's when you start bolting on all of the aero that we tend to see all the poorer racing because of all the turbulent air, et cetera, and the tires degrading, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I mean, if they can find a way of sorting that out, I mean, it would be great, for sure.
Well, I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussions, because June 28th, it'll be officially ratified by the World Motorsport Council.